you really need to look down and like talk with your partner or like talk
Yeah.
with your support network. Like, what am I able to handle? Why am I going through this path in particular?
Yeah.
Because it's similar to like parenting biologically in some ways, but in others it's completely different because
Yeah.
like generally you're not picking out a baby out of a lineup if you're carrying a baby. You know, genes decide
Yeah.
that. But with adoption, there are a lot of choices that you have to make up
Yeah.
front.
I'm Keltie McGuire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about something that we have too seldom tabled on the podcast, and that is adoption. And I have to say that when I came across Melissa Guida-Richards and her work, I was super intrigued, not only because she's an expert on this topic, but because she is an adoptee herself. And it basically informed me, the work that she's doing and what she shares on her Instagram channel, Adoptee Thoughts, just how important it is that we also listen to, and I would say importantly, most importantly, listen to adoptees on this topic of adoption and the considerations that we should be making if we are considering adopting, how we can go about adoption in the most ethical way, if that's the path that we take to parenthood. So very fascinated to learn about her work and knew that she would be a wonderful guest to have on the podcast. And lucky for all of us, she said yes to joining me today. Melissa Guida-Richards is a transracial adoptee, author, and advocate whose work explores child welfare, adoption influencers, ethics, and reform. She is the author of What White Parents Should Know About Transracial Adoption, and she's had her writing and interviews featured on national platforms including NBC, Good Day LA, and Tamron Hall. Melissa, thank you so much for being here today. As you and I were just chatting about, there's much to talk about, so we're going to get right into things. And why don't we start by you just sharing a little bit about yourself and your story?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Melissa Guida-Richards. I'm an adoptee, an adoption educator. I was adopted about 5 months old from an orphanage in Bogota, Colombia, and to a family in the United States. And my story is a little bit more complicated than the average adoptions because I'm also a late discovery adoptee. And all those like fancy terms basically means that I didn't find out that I was adopted until later in life. I grew up in an immigrant Italian and Portuguese family that was very multicultural. So they were kind of able to pass me and my brother as Italian. And so about 10, 11 years ago, that's when The Secret came out, and I kind of just dove face first into this whole adoption world. And it opened so many doors for me, not just to understand like the industry as a whole in the United States and how other countries approach adoption, but how it affects families on a very unique level. And so I've really found my passion in educating adoptive parents and just really working towards creating as much support for children as possible in trying to lean professionals and adoptive parents towards more trauma-informed, child-centered care. So that's where it leads me now. I have 2 books on adoption called What White Parents Should Know About Transracial Adoption and the follow-up workbook. And then I have a bunch of other work that you can find on my website, adopteethoughts.com. Everything's linked on my socials. But yeah, so that's a little bit about me.
Okay, well, we'll definitely make sure to link your 2 books in the show notes, as well as, of course, where people can find you. And I discovered you through Instagram. And then as I went onto your website, I was like, oh my God, there's like this wealth of work that you do and resources that you offer. And you know, as I shared with you, and probably is going to be the case for many of the people listening, I know next to nothing about adoption. I mean, we can just sort of say nothing for our intents and purposes today. We've actually only had a single guest on the podcast to date who is a parent who went the adoption route in Canada, which of course will have its differences from the US and other places. And you know, I hear things like the language you just used about like child-centered adoption. And I understand, and you know, I want to make this really clear in our conversation today, why we need to center the adoptees and the children themselves when considering this path. And yet, your kind of messaging and a lot of what I see and hear come through your work is like, we need to be listening to adoptees and adult adoptees about their experiences. And I want to say it both seems like a no-brainer, and yet it's nothing I'd ever considered before, because I think a lot of the conversation, and correct me if I'm wrong, and what I see is like, we've got these so-called, experts, we've got bureaucrats, we've got adoptive parents, we've got potential adoptive parents. And yet, where are the people who are and have been adopted in this conversation? Is that something that, first of all, maybe just tell us why this is so important. And is this something that has generally been lacking? And how's that changed or is changing?
Oh, definitely. This has been an issue since like the inception of adoption practices in like every country. There was historically a lot of stigma when it came to adoption. So they had what's called a positive adoption language created, and just all these methods to kind of like match children based on appearances to the parents adopting them. So there would be like a seamless introduction to the family, so there'd be less questions asked, and it was just kind of a like don't ask, don't tell type of situation. And so that led to a lot of people kind of just downplaying it and focusing on like the child rearing part of it, and people just really viewed adoption as this happily ever after ending. And so what people have been learning is that adoption doesn't stop when those papers are finalized. And even if you adopt a newborn, there was like this idea that a newborn would be a blank slate, and then you get to start fresh and all these like wonderful things, not understanding that there are traumas involved in maternal separation, whether it's at birth or whether the child is older. And so as the research has gone down, and how many more adoptees and former foster youth are speaking out, people are becoming more aware of like why adoptees struggle with certain things like addiction and mental health difficulties. There are increased risks of like ADHD, all these things. And so it's become really refreshing in these past, I would say like 5 to 10 years, where the industry and where foster care agencies and professionals are now making it more of a priority to include these voices. So you'll see many more speakers that have lived experience, who have been in care, who have had guardians, or been in kinship adoptions or been adopted themselves. And just seeing the progress and like how much support does for the children that are now in this system, it really has kind of changed the whole thing, where people are opening their eyes to this.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting what you said about, this idea of, a baby's a clean slate. And I hear this sort of framing with people saying, well, I don't know if I'd want to adopt an older child, or sort of this idea that an infant comes with, quote, less problems, which is probably really problematic sort of language and thinking in itself. And yet I appreciate that for a lot of people, the prospect of adopting a child with a history, which of course every child has a history, it can feel heavy, and like they're not really sure how to go about navigating all this, and if this is perhaps or could be the right path for them. And again, I've seen and heard this through your I have to credit your channel with like first really landing the idea that of course maternal separation is a trauma, like regardless of if that happens at day 1 or 3 months in, like of course. And I think, and I hope that we have, through psychology and science and research, like more in-depth understanding of that. But this idea of this is better, and maybe you can speak to, perhaps there are, maybe adopting younger versus older children is more well suited for certain people than others. But I really appreciate like all of the nuance you are able to help bring to this conversation, and to be able to speak from your perspective, not just as an educator, but as someone who was adopted. So, okay, I want to hear more about your personal story. And I just, for the sake of the conversation, you are a mother yourself, correct? You have 2 children?
Yes, I have 2 biological children, both boys, and they're under 10 and they're about 17 months apart.
Wow, really close in age. Okay. You mentioned I have 2 biological children. Very few people introduce the fact that they're a parent in that way. Do you say that because you often, as an adoptee, get asked, are they, quote, And it's so interesting, the language, right? People use are they yours? Are they yeah, they're my children, regardless of how they came into my life. But do people ask you that a lot? Is that a question?
Oh yeah, people want to know if I've adopted. I've had experience working within the system. If my children, all that stuff, and I tend not to share too many details about my children, but I think it is relevant to the conversation. I do say that, like, I have two biological children. I have two sons, but I did have a temporary kinship placement for about a year that I did with an extended relative. And so just people want to kind of like justify how you are incorporated in the system yourself, because they're like, well, if you've never parented in that capacity, how can you possibly,
Okay. Yeah, interesting. Okay. So let's just start at the very beginning here. I mean, there's a lot of questions that I encourage people to ask themselves in general if they're considering parenthood or, for that matter, continuing to live a child-free life. But specific to adoption, what are some questions that people should be asking themselves before embarking on this process, or to just consider, like, is this something that I might want to do?
Yeah, my first question that I tell adoptive parents is to really dig deep and look at what is their why. Because it seems like a simple question, and people will be like, oh, because I want a child. And usually with adoption, it's like, I want to give a child a better life. But why? Why do you really want to go through adoption? And then when you think about adoption, they generally break it down into like a few different categories. You have international adoption, domestic adoption, you have foster care adoption, kinship adoption, and like people will like have a definite idea of where they want to go. They'll be like, well, I definitely don't want to go through foster care because I don't want to adopt an older child. But that immediately limits your choices, and that is impacted by your why. So why are you doing this? If you want to give a child a better life, like all of these technically are opening up to that possibility. So I really try to get them to ask themselves and ask their spouse or their partner to get to the nitty gritty. And ironically enough, like studies have shown that in couples and heterosexual couples, it's generally the woman that is pushing towards adoption too. So I really, really, really encourage getting the male spouse incorporated in these early discussions, because just as women in general, we tend to take on a lot of the mental load. And so when it comes to adoption and child rearing, like, this is a lot that goes into it. So you need a partner who's going to be willing to work with you on these tough conversations from the beginning. So like that's another aspect that I make sure parents are aware of.
I think that's super important. And I mean, in general with this kids or child-free decision, but I would say in particular, like I think people can glaze over the whole thing and just be like, yeah, okay, sure, that sounds good or whatever. I'd be open to that, or I don't need to, pass along my DNA, like, let's go for it. And to your point, like there's so much more considerations that need to be made, and that they should be made jointly if we're talking about a couple. Now, I am curious, and this is a little bit of a sidebar, but for people who are interested in pursuing solo parenthood, is adoption a viable possible path? Are there additional challenges in terms of going about that? Like, I know, for example, in some countries, they have like age limits for adoption from the parent side, or they've got certain requirements that they have. I'm guessing in some countries, it might be like you need to be married. I'm not sure to what that extent that's true, but what about solo parents in places like the States, for example?
Yeah, there are so many different rules and regulations depending on the country, the state, domestic, international. I think solo parenting is a great option for some people, but like all parents or caregivers, you need to understand what your capabilities are. You need to make sure that you have a village. You need to make sure that you have enough resources in general. That I always tell parents, like, make sure that you've done your own work healing from any past difficulties that you may have before considering adoption. Because when you become a parent, especially through adoption, you are choosing to put this child in another situation where they, at the end of the day, they are removed from one family of origin and placed in another. And so there are going to be bumps in the road, no matter how many books you read, no matter how much you prepare. So taking that on as a solo parent, there are going to be other challenges involved, but I think it's totally doable. There are many parents out there who rock at it and who have a great way to go about it. But it's just like one of those things that you have to just compensate in other areas when you know, like, again, your limitations.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Now, to go back to the why question, I think that's such an important question for us to ask in this situation in particular, and like in general with this decision. What's your opinion in terms of there being better or worse whys? Like, would you say there's a why where you're like, yield, red flag, like do not proceed, or are all whys equal as long as we're connected to them? I'm interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to adoption and foster care, there are definitely like red flags. Like if someone were to say, well, I want to adopt a child so I can be the next Brad and Angelina Jolie, and so I can show off my baby and become an adoption influencer. Like stuff like that, giant red flag. Whoa, put on the brakes. No. But generally, where I'm coming for with this question is getting to these uncomfortable conversations that we need to have, because even just myself, when I was deciding to become a parent, my why was innately selfish. I wanted to become a parent. Me and my partner decided that we wanted to carry on our genes, and being adopted myself, that impacted my decision. I didn't know any biological relatives at the time, and dealing with infertility and endometriosis and stuff like that, like it was definitely on the top of my mind. Like if I don't do this, like I might lose out. So innately, like I feel like a lot of parents are kind of afraid and hesitant to acknowledge that there is a selfish part of it. But as humans, I feel like that's almost like natural biology. We want to continue our genes. Like that's just something that many of us feel called to do, especially if we are females. And we hear it all the time, pressure from society, your biological clock is ticking, this and that. So when I get to like the what is your why, I think it's okay for potential adoptive parents to be like, well, because I really want to become a parent, because I see myself as a mother, and I've always been caring and whatever, but like look deeper too. So it's just like, well, why adoption? Why do you want to go through this path? And they literally, like a lot of agencies and a lot of organizations will like sit you down with a packet where you have to check like what you are open to: male, female, age, race, type of disability, health issues, contact with drugs in utero, like all these different questions. So when you're going through that, like you really need to look down and like talk with your partner, or like talk with your support network. Like, what am I able to handle? Why am I going through this path in particular? Because it's similar to like parenting biologically in some ways, but in others it's completely different, because like generally you're not picking out a baby out of a lineup if you're carrying a baby. You know, genes decide that. But with adoption, there are a lot of choices that you have to make up front.
Yeah. Well, and I think that it certainly adds another layer of complexity for these folks that I coach who are indecisive, right? They're listening to this podcast. They're like, I can't even decide if I want to have a kid or not. And I often talk about that based on people's circumstances. For example, if they're looking at doing or pursuing solo parenthood, if they're, for example, queer and they know that they can't just simply, make a baby the way that a heterosexual couple can, if they're dealing with fertility challenges, with each of those circumstances, of course, and then of course, adoption, there's additional layers of decision, which can be challenging, right? And so I guess what I'm hearing from you is like starting with and connecting with that internal driver, that why, could potentially help better answer some of those further questions in terms of like, it's kind of a bizarre thing to like, in a sense, I think you use the words, I wouldn't say this, but like pick a baby out of a lineup. And yet it's not, my understanding is, and at least in the conversation that I had with our past guest, Liz, is that when you start to say, no, I only want an infant, no, I don't want a child who has potential or known disabilities, like et cetera, you are limiting the possibility that you will successfully adopt a child. Is that true, would you say, or is it important to narrow things down?
Oh, definitely. There are pros and cons with this from every single angle, but when we're looking at it like that, we just data wise, there are about anywhere from a dozen to like 30 couples per infant available to adopt.
Okay.
So people are waiting on an average a year to 2 years, sometimes much longer, because there's a preference to adopt a younger baby because of this blank slate theory. So what happens is we'll have agencies, especially for-profit agencies, that will encourage prospective parents and couples to open up their options and their choices and being like, well, we know you really want to adopt a boy, but that's going to limit you. And like for some reason this year, we've just had a lot of girls or something like that, something that seems innocuous. But at the end of the day, it doesn't just stop there. And then they'll open it up to like race. It's just like, we know you wanted a white baby, but would you be open to a multiracial baby or a mixed baby? And they will purposefully use this type of language to kind of sugarcoat things in a way, because about 70%, at least in the United States, 70% of adopted parents are white. So generally people tend to be more comfortable adopting within their own race because that's what they're familiar with. And so when it comes to agencies and the children that are available for adoption, there are a large number of Black and brown babies. And people have this idea that, oh, well, if the baby is mixed race or multiracial or biracial, they are more easily able to like relate to them because they aren't just like 100% Black or 100% Native American or whatever the race or ethnicity is. And so the adoption industry will kind of pose that as just like, oh, well, you know, multiracial babies, like, why don't you just open up your door to that instead of just saying white babies? And that's where like the whitewashing kind of goes in the adoption industry, because they, at the end of the day, with this for-profit adoption industry, yes, a lot of them care for kids, but there is a bottom line here, and it is a business. At the end of the day, the more placements they have, the more money they make, because like these companies are charging like 50, sometimes nowadays it's like $70,000 per adoption. So the more they get these prospective adoptive parents to open their kind of decision on the type of child that they are willing to adopt, that opens it up for them as well. So the pros and cons with that, with the adoptive parents too, is just like, oh, well, we'll probably get a placement a lot sooner if we aren't looking for a baby that looks exactly like us. Or if we're starting to say like, oh, well, we might be open to matching with an expectant parent who has used substances during utero, but only these. Or certain things like that. Like there will be like accommodations made and then justifications for that, whether you personally, you're like, well, I can handle that because these are like the possible side effects of that. But at the end of the day, like any child at any time can become disabled or have complications, mental and physically. So that's just something to keep in mind, because like I said, the adoption industry paints this as like a happily ever after. But with any parenting journey, like having a baby and welcoming a child into your home, that's just the beginning. And part of that is really beautiful. But as a mom of two kids, like it also is really stressful as well.
Okay. You know, and it's interesting. I'm just thinking like on the one hand, we could say, oh, you know, it's great to encourage people to consider adopting a baby or child from a different race than their own. But do you think it also kind of just like glosses over the fact that there are important and additional considerations to make, for example, in that case? Like,
oh, 100%.
There
has been an issue, like I said, with like the stigma in adoption, but just focusing on the fact that if you're adopting a child of another race or another culture, even just from another country, there are different considerations involved. because the child has already grown up in that area and been in contact with that culture, the language, or whatever it is, or just has biological ties to a completely different culture than the parent. And what happens is a lot of agencies, they focus on like, okay, well, obviously we need child welfare checks and home studies and all these things. We need to make sure you have enough resources, money, a stable job, childcare, whatever it is. Like those are all very important, but people are just kind of like dipping their toes and understanding that racial identity has a huge impact on self-esteem and development of children. And so that's why we're kind of seeing this insurgence of adoptees and foster youth talking about how this was really neglected in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s when I was adopted, and even the early 2000s. Like this was something that people didn't really talk about. We just heard like, oh, well, Brad and Angelina and Madonna, like all these people, they're adopting a baby and it's beautiful. They went to this other country, but not realizing that there is much more to the story. So like I was adopted into a different country and I didn't have any exposure to my birth culture until I was an adult. And so that just in general, just like that made me struggle with my identity because other people, they see me and they immediately will clock me and put me in a category. She's Latina. Like I go out in the stores, like half the time people are just automatically talking to me in Spanish. So like now I get that because like I understand, but growing up, like imagine that happening year after year after year, and then going to your parents and being like, well, why are people talking to me in Spanish? Like, oh, don't care about what other people say. What other people say doesn't matter. You're a daughter. We love you. That is wonderful. That color blindness, like idea of just like, it doesn't matter if you're black, white, purple, polka dotted. Like that's a wonderful idea in concept, but it's very idealistic. And if we look at like the real life consequences, we know that racism is real. And even though race is a social construct, its implications and its effects on people in any country are very, very prevalent. And so I think more agencies in general, like they'll hire people like me to come and teach conversations on transracial adoption and just like the importance of it, why growing up without it is a huge issue, how we can incorporate that. And I think a lot of it stems from just like, it's not necessarily something people are doing to like harm people. It's not like they're like, oh, well, I'm not going to talk about this because I don't care. It's usually just like, I am planning on being a parent. There are already 70,000 steps that I have to go through for this path. And that's something that kind of just gets shoved under the rug. And it is kind of like the onus is on the adoption agencies and the foster care agencies and child welfare professionals to kind of push the importance of this, because now we know better. There's been a lot of research on racial identity, and there's been a lot of research on child development and why these topics are so important, especially at such a young age when people are just forming their own little personalities and they're like little sponges that pick up everything. And so I think that's why we are getting into these conversations a little more. I think I got sidetracked, but
no, that's amazing. And this is, of course, your specialty, if you will, as far as the focus that you've got in a lot of your work and your book. If you can just tell us the name again, because it focuses on transracial adoption specifically.
Yeah, it's called What White Parents Should Know About Transracial Adoption. It's in like anywhere you buy books, or local libraries tend to have it, or you can request that they get a copy if they don't. There is an audiobook for the first book, and then the second is a workbook. So that will have like actual activities and different things that you can go through to work with your partner or by yourself or with your family to make sure you're prepared.
And would you say that's a good book for someone to read if they're considering adoption in general, and also if they're trying to discern, like, would I consider, or is a transracial adoption sort of that right path forward? Or is this more something that like, no, we've already decided that that's the way forward and then I should check out this book?
Yeah, I think it's good for anyone, particularly like the first one. Like, if you are just considering adoption, it gives you a lot of different perspectives. I interviewed several different adoptive parents, as well as included a lot of insight from other adoptees as well. So there's a little bit of everything, and there's like a whole bunch of resources and like articles referenced in there that gives you the history of adoption. And no matter which path you are taking, whether it's domestic, international, transracial, whatever, like they're all interconnected because this is a history of adoption, and one path is like always like impacting the history of like how the rest of adoption has progressed in different
Okay.
countries and different states. So I think it's a good starter for
Yeah.
anybody interested in it, but it definitely, if you are even like considering for like a second to open your home to a cross-cultural
Yeah.
adoption.
I have been listening to your feedback on the workshops and events and programs that I've been hosting over these last few years. So, what have I created for you? Well, it is called Kids or Childfree on Demand. And these are resources, classes for you that you can access anytime, anywhere. I have put together a series of different classes that you can purchase a la carte, one off. You can buy one, two, as many as you want, addressing different topics like a difference of opinion. We've got one that is all about an uncertain future. We've got a class about navigating difficult emotions. I have created these as 1 hour on-demand classes that you can access again, anytime, anywhere. You will also get a fillable workbook that you can fill out digitally or you can print off that accompanies the class. I share additional resources with you in the class portal. If you want access to all classes, you can do so for $249, and that will give you a lifetime membership to other similar types of classes. So essentially, the value you get, the savings that you're able to have or experience from that will only increase over time. So you can access these on-demand classes for $49 each. Head to the show notes or the website where you will find the link to our on-demand classes, our class collection. You can get started right away. You don't have to wait for me. You don't have to wait for the perfect time to fit this in your schedule. Whenever you have a few moments, you can tune into these classes. I know you're going to love what I have created for you, and I'm really excited to hear your feedback and hear how these classes are able to support you on your kids or child-free journey. All right, let's get back to today's conversation.
So if I feel like, okay, I'm quite clear about, adoption is a path for me. And actually, let me back that up. Let me say, for example, a lot of people come, correct me if I'm wrong, but my perception is a lot of people come to the adoption choice after saying it's not possible or unlikely for me to have biological children. I am, past the age of that possibility. Some people, certainly that might be immediately their first preference, but would you say, or is that true that for other people, it's often a second or even third choice after IVF fails or after whatever? And what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's bad and it should ideally be people's first preference? Or is it like, that's just kind of the way that this goes?
I don't think it's bad, but I think it is still very taboo for people to admit that. People don't like saying that adoption is their second option, but the reality is a significant portion of couples and hopeful parents only choose adoption because every other available path has not succeeded for them. And so I think acknowledging that, like, that goes back to like, what is your why? Like, why are you here? How'd you get here? Like, how are you moving forward? And it really shapes that. But I generally, I don't think that's some moral failing. I think there are always going to be people who have opinions and think like, well, you're only doing this for selfish reasons. You just want a kid. It didn't work out for you. Don't adopt. You don't deserve a kid because, if God said your reproductive system is not working right now, well, take that as a sign. Like, there are people who literally like think that, and there are people who are very anti-adoption. There are people who are very pro-adoption. And that's where, like, I'm in the middle. I'm in the nuance.
I was going to ask, where are you?
Yeah. So I'm just like, I definitely see why it could upset people. And like, just like on this topic, the same thing, like there will be some couples who adopt because they struggled with infertility, who will later on conceive naturally and be
Yep.
able to have a biological child. And that's where I see issues form, because there can be, unfortunately, a favoritism that can become apparent, where the parents are treating the children differently because they're like, well, we wanted a biological child.
Yeah.
Like, this is something special. My bond with this child is a lot different. And so I think it does take a certain type of person to open their hearts and open their homes. And I think that's okay to acknowledge, and it's especially important to even consider that. So, like, just thinking in the future, like, if you had a child and you had two children, one was biological, one was not, one was adopted, like, would you treat them completely the same? Like, how would you parent them moving forward? What if there was a mental health crisis and the adopted child was developing some aggressive behaviors? Are you going to rehome that child as soon as it becomes difficult? Would you do the same if it was the biological child? Because there are many times that I think the rates are between like 5 and 10% for like adoption dissolutions, which is basically like rehoming children.
I didn't even know that was a thing, by the way. Like, I thought this is what we do with animals, which frankly, I take issue with in itself. Okay, 5 to 10%. Okay.
Yeah, there's adoption dissolutions, and there's just like interruptions as well. I forgot the other term, but basically, like, it's still an issue. And there's this huge case. There's a documentary about it on HBO with Micah Stafer. She adopted a child from China. And
I think I heard about this person, not the documentary, but was she like an influencer or something like that?
Yes, she was this big mom influencer, adopted the baby, recorded the whole process, did like a little bit of fundraising, all this stuff. And she even went so far as to like even try to adopt another child, but she already had several biological children, and then got pregnant again after she adopted this child from China. And so the baby, the toddler, she knew he was going to have some sorts of disabilities. She particularly like chose this path to adopt a child that she knew was going to have some type of medical problems. And as it happened, that impacted his growth, and he had some meltdowns, and it turned out that he ended up being like autistic and having some other struggles. And they couldn't handle it. The parents could not handle the needs that he had. And so ultimately they decided to rehome him. But again, this was like an influencer family. So they were recording like daily vlogs, or like, let me go pick up my child from China and you come with me, like all these things. And then all of a sudden they just stopped posting, and people were like, wait, what's going on? Where's your son? Where'd he go? And they just tried to sweep it under the rug, because there is a lot of flashback, whether you are an influencer or just like a day-to-day person who doesn't post their lives. If you tell someone like, oh yeah, well, we turns out I adopted this child, couldn't handle it, and gave him back to foster care. So there are a lot of children, unfortunately, who are adopted internationally. There tends to be a lot more, or through foster care, who end up being rehomed time and time again. And it's just like a horrible situation where there are honestly no perfect solutions as of right now, but it's something that needs to be made more aware of, and we need to definitely keep working on that area.
Wow, that's heartbreaking. And I mean, I suppose we could say that if a family ultimately, like if they're not able to adequately care for and raise this child, then perhaps we can say maybe it's better if they find a different home. But like, that's an additional trauma, of course. My God, I can only imagine that the imprint or mark that must leave that. Oh, okay. Is it a good documentary, or is this like trash TV we shouldn't watch? Is this, do you think it has good things to say from a standpoint of like, or should people not watch this?
I think honestly, they did a pretty okay job with it. Okay. I've seen like the Curious Case of Natalia Grace. Like that one was just nonsense. But with the one with Micah Stafer, they actually had like adoptees involved in the production of
Okay.
this. One is Cam Lee Small. He's a licensed therapist and an adoptee. He added his perspective into it and some of like his like studies into the subject. And
Yeah.
then also the kind of like narrator of the documentary, her name is Hannah Cho, I believe, and she is adopted herself and she did influencing. So you had like a perspective that kind of like shaped it. So it wasn't like saying like, oh, Micah Stafer is like the devil. No, it was like, this is what happened.
Yeah.
This is like the influencer world. And then it had other influencer families there. So you kind of get a little taste of everything. And I think it's a good introduction, but definitely not like the end all be all. You need to do other research involved, but it definitely to get like your toes wet in the subject if you've never learned about it before.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. All right. So if we've decided then, you know, I think adoption might be that path forward. Again, the question for a lot of people is like, what age of child would I best like to adopt? Do you think there's questions we should ask ourselves to sort of ascertain like what might be the good best fit for both us and the child? Or how would you go about or advise somebody to go about thinking about that?
Yeah,
Or
I
is that
mean,
the right question to ask? Should it be like, no, if you want to adopt any child at any age?
I think if we're being realistic and we're being
Yeah.
honest, I think you need to really sit down and look at those sheets of what agencies provide and like all the options out there. Because at the end of the day, you and your partner only know what you're equipped to handle and what you think you might be able to handle. And sometimes that is not always accurate. Once you open your doors and like say you start fostering for a little bit and you're like, okay, I only want children under the age of 4. You end up caring for children in those ages and realize, whoa, not for me. Like our family is not set up for that at all. So I definitely encourage a lot of exposure and like hands-on getting involved with different organizations, because I think people will think also from this place, they're like, well, I want to help a child. And they immediately jump, well, adoption is helping a child. Let me adopt. Instead of realizing that, well, you don't have to adopt right away. There are many different ways that you can help children in care before taking that step. Ways that will also encourage and educate you on different things that you need to learn to better prepare the child. And when you're taking a child-centered, trauma-informed approach, you are putting the children's needs first. So if you are completely 100% selfless and you're doing this just for the child, I would say you wouldn't even consider a newborn. You wouldn't even consider a baby. You would consider children who are at least 6 years old and up, particularly older children, because there are a lot of older children in foster care that are looking for homes. So like if you're thinking technically on a very like child-centered trauma-informed approach, if this is for children only, like that's the approach you would get. But if you're looking again at like what is your why and being honest with yourself and honest with your partner, understanding, well, I want to parent a younger child. I want to go through all these milestones of learning to walk in the first words and taking them to preschool and all these special moments. Like, I don't think it's bad to want that, but you have to acknowledge that if you do want that and you choose that path, then you are choosing a certain type of adoption that there are significant ethical issues with in many countries.
Okay. And so, I mean, again, not every country offers every different type of adoption, but you've mentioned kinship adoption, which would be, I'm guessing that's typically like circumstantially something comes up where it's a family member, immediate, or it could be a distant family member, that there's a child that needs a home. Is that?
Yeah, kinship adoption is generally with a family member or a close family friend. And generally in the same area, they'll look for like the closest family members, and if not, like family friends or like people who have been in the child's life, and then like extend it to like biological relatives that are like in another state or however far away. So there are, again, pros and cons with that as well. And the unfortunate side of kinship adoption is that even though like it tends to be a really great way to do like child centered care, especially keeping close to the biological ties, there are not as many resources as if this was a stranger foster care situation in a lot of places. So there won't be like as many like programs like food snaps and like different like WIC and things that you won't necessarily qualify for just because you're related to the child. And again, this varies again greatly by state, by county. It's a huge issue with adoption laws not being equal across states.
Okay. And presumably as well, like, again, I think a person obviously needs to still connect with that why and have this openness to that. But I think about like, I would think that would be a little bit harder to plan for if somebody in and of themselves in their life is like, oh, do I want to have a child or not? Yeah. Okay. I do want to have kids or kid. And I think adoption would be a great path forward. Like to suddenly have like a kinship quote, I don't want to say opportunity, but you can tell I'm like being very careful with my language. I hope not overly obnoxiously so, but I'm like, don't want to put my foot in my mouth. Okay. So kinship adoption, then there's what are the other ones? There's foster to adopt. Is that a good way to proceed because it gives you a taste of what it might be like, or how does that work?
Okay. So this is another like contentious issue because foster care at the core of it is not supposed to be about family planning. It's supposed to be about family preservation. So couples and single parents that are going into foster care should not necessarily, if this is a child-centered, trauma-informed approach, be thinking, well, I'm only going into foster care because I want to adopt a baby. And again, this tends to lean heavily towards the individuals that are looking for younger children, because they're like, well, if I foster the baby, then like they're with me for a year, 2 years, like obviously I'm the best home for them. And there's been a lot of like contention where like the biological family will be fit, and then we have these two separate entities fighting over a child. So like there's a lot of complications involved with that. But at the end of the day, too, we do need to consider that there are many children in foster care that have been legally separated from their biological parents and biological families and are not able to legally reunify with their families of origin. So there are children who are looking for permanent homes. So again, it's one of those things where you need to understand that if you are going into this and you're like, well, I do want to foster, but I am open to the idea of adoption, but that's not going to be my like full intention. Understanding that going in and fostering, this is your main priority, is to support this child in need through their family separation and to give this child as much love, support, care as they can while they're in your care, with the reality of just like, you're not necessarily going to get anything back. It's like one of those things. It's just like, are you doing this really to help, or are you only doing this to get something out of it? And again, like, I don't think it's bad that people want to become parents, but this is just another type of parenting and caregiving. And if it's not for you, it's not for you, but that's something that you need to acknowledge up front, because if you are just saying this to yourself because you want people to perceive you a certain way, or because you're embarrassed and you don't want to have these uncomfortable conversations with your caseworker or whatever, you're doing yourself a disservice and you're doing the child a disservice.
Yeah. Okay. I think we definitely need to have a dedicated conversation on the podcast about fostering, and whether that's you have a colleague perhaps you can connect me with that specializes in that area, or if this is something you feel well versed in. Because I know some people, specifically those who are maybe, and maybe this is also not the right reason to pursue fostering, but maybe they're not able to or wanting to pursue the commitment of their own child, but there is something that speaks to them about being involved in supporting and helping with a child's life for periods of time. We can maybe talk about whether that's a good or bad idea or approach, but fostering, I agree, probably lives in and of itself. And it sounds like it could potentially lead to adoption, but a person, if they really are keen on adopting, it shouldn't be that like the sole reason I'm doing this is so I can hopefully adopt that child. Okay. Then what other, I think there were like 4 different kinds. So kinship adoption, foster to adopt,
you have
international adoption.
Yes, international
is that
adoption.
one that's ethically murky, would you say?
I wouldn't even say it's ethically murky. I would say it's outright, honestly, in a majority of cases, unethical.
Okay.
And we've seen the evidence of that, especially in this past year or two. If you've seen any of the news of what happened with the Korean adoptions and the Chinese adoptions, even like Colombian adoptions, where there are a lot of places that hid or completely rewrote documents and claimed that children were orphans when in reality they were taken from their biological parents and put in the orphanage because it is a multi-billion-dollar business. And so in a majority of cases, like I would say, like steer clear of international adoption, because it is one of the most unethical ways to go that about. And I am an international adoptee. I know that
Yeah.
I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that. And of course, like I love my parents. Me and my mom are really close. My dad has since passed, but me and my brother were both internationally adopted. Do I wish that never happened? No, but I wish there were certain circumstances that were different that
Mm-hmm.
didn't harm other people so my adoptive family could have their dream. And
Yeah.
so I think people need to understand and go into this with a really, really clear
Yeah.
vision of what it is, because at the end of the day, there are people and there are organizations that are targeting a lot of what they perceive as third world countries that are underdeveloped. They are taking advantage of mothers and pregnant people in crisis situations to help, as they put it.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, it's not much help. And just for like an example, of like when I was adopted, my parents were told one thing. They were told that my birth mother had all the time in the world. She had several months to decide whether or not that uh, she was going to continue and place me. When the reality was, as soon as she gave birth in the hospital, they forced her to sign papers, didn't let her hold me, and whisked me away. She never saw
Oh
me
my God.
again, never had a chance. So, like, we have two different stories that are completely like
Yeah.
one is completely sugar coated to make the adopted family feel like, oh, well, we gave every opportunity. Well, we didn't know any better. But like nowadays, you do know better. There
Yeah.
are plenty of studies. There are plenty of news articles out there. Just look into Korean adoptions, Chinese adoptions, and the atrocious things that they have done to hide records and eliminate evidence of wrongdoing, and just how like literally I'm pretty sure like South Korea apologized for the harm that it caused for international adoptees. And so there are many levels that go into this, but I would
Mm-hmm.
say just from a start, like really just steer clear of
Okay.
international adoption. I don't know in any cases where it's ethical. The only area where I can kind of like justify it is like certain areas in certain countries, children with disabilities just do not have the structural support in
Mm-hmm.
those areas. So like if you are really open to a child with significant disabilities and have a lot of resources medically, financially, and socially to support your family,
Yeah.
then okay, maybe consider adoption
Okay.
that way, but really it should not be your first option.
I so appreciate your like straight talk and your honesty about that. It's super helpful. Thank you. Okay, and the last area would be domestic adoption. So, and is that well? I mean, and I don't want to split too many different hairs here because again, every country is probably going to be a bit different. But in the U.S. in particular, there's like a for-profit adoption industry. Is that right? And then
Yeah.
there's not for profit, like within that would be more within like bureaucracy, government. What am I trying to say here? Like you're not.
That's generally through child
Yeah.
welfare and the foster care
Thank you.
system.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, in the U.S., we have a really, really huge thriving industry that's for profit, and generally there are a lot of like crisis pregnancy centers that will try to encourage pregnant people in crisis to consider adoption rather than choosing abortion. There are a lot of states, especially those states that have limited abortion, who have increased like their safe haven baby box placements. They have increased their crisis pregnancy centers and these adoption agencies. And just recently, our government, I think Trump, he signed this executive order that on the outside looks very, very promising because it's helping more supports for foster care. But inside it also is including language that says that prospective foster parents and adoptive parents, their religious beliefs, basically they need to be valued above agencies' policies or things. So an example of that is there was this one couple in particular that was denied a foster care license because they wouldn't sign the agency's agreement that says that we will honor and respect any child's gender identity or LGBTQ plus status and whatever it is. And they're like, well, my religion refuses me to allow to consider that. And so they got really upset. They sued or whatever. So now Trump passed this. So this is going to push more agencies to have to allow these parents that have very strict personal beliefs and impacting how they treat children in their care. And so it's just a very complicated system, which is impacted by multiple different things. And we have state laws, we have federal laws, and there are huge loopholes. And like in Utah, especially, there are a lot of lax adoption laws. So we'll have agencies and facilitators take pregnant people from other states to live and move into Utah for like the duration of their pregnancy so they can have the child there and place them as easily as possible so they don't have to go through all these checks and balances that in other states have been implemented to keep the birthing parent safe and the child safe, because it makes it easier to just facilitate an adoption without questions asked. And like one of the things that they do is there's a law where you don't have to like itemize and like show receipts of like where the money is going towards the expectant parent. So they'll literally like Venmo expectant parents like $3,000 like travel costs or like entertainment and food, like housing, and like not show like where that money is going. Yeah. And again, like we're talking about an industry where you're saying purchasing a human is illegal, but you're exchanging money for a person's child. And this is a very gray, murky area where it's like, okay, what are we doing here? And at the end of the day, like I said, like this isn't 20, 30 years ago where you can be like, oh, I didn't know, you know. And if you don't know, there's plenty of resources and ways that you can find out.
I think, that's one of the biggest takeaways from this conversation that I hope people are having is like, there's absolutely no reason or zero excuse not to educate yourself about like, the state of the adoption industry in your own country, to really be listening to stories from adoptees and to be considering the ethical quandaries or sort of ramifications of this decision and the way that it's being executed on. Do you have any favorite, and again, maybe some in the US, but then in general, like, do you have any favorite resources or websites or anything like that that people should be checking out if they're considering adoption?
Yeah, I think Case Adopt, they have a lot of resources for adoptive families. We have transracial adoption journeys. They do this heritage camp during the summer to help mentor and kind of get adoptive families to understand like multiculturalism and all like the beautiful ways they can connect to their family like that. The Adoptee Mentoring Society does a lot of one-on-one mentoring virtually, and it does like group meetings, lounges for children, teens, and adults that are adoptees. So that provides a lot of resources like across the spectrum. Yeah. And so there are so many good things there. And in chapter 9 of my book, there like I have like dozens of resources
Amazing.
listed there.
Okay. This is like the no-brainer move then, is that people have to buy your book. Again, we will include it in the show notes. We unfortunately didn't get to delve too much into your own motherhood decision story, which is perhaps something we can explore in the future. But is there anything that you want to share with people who are either on the fence about having kids or staying child-free, or on the fence about whether adoption might be a path forward for them?
Yeah, like I said, like I feel like everybody's decision to parent or not to parent is very personal, and I don't necessarily think it's a terrible thing to say like, well, I chose to adopt, or I'm choosing to have children because I wanted children. Like I think it's
Yeah.
a little bit of a self decision, and like I'm not gonna lie and say that didn't impact my own decision.
Yeah.
I think admitting that is the first step to really acknowledge, like, well, why are you parenting, how you're going to approach parenting, and if you're going to approach it with grace and kindness and humility to kind of just really focus on the goal. And I think all of us who are intending to parent, generally, we want to support our children and we want to make sure that they are raised and respected and turn into kind human beings that are able to contribute to society. Mm-hmm. And to do that, like you have to model a lot of those things. And so like I said, I think it's okay to want to have children, to want to adopt, but be honest with yourself about it, because that will be key to being able to support the child in your care, is being able to get comfortable being uncomfortable with these conversations, because one day your child is going to ask like, mommy, daddy, mom, why did you adopt me? Like, why did you choose this way? And you can tell the same old story that people say. It was like, well, I just wanted a child. I wanted to give a child a better life. But kids are curious and they're going to ask like these deeper questions. Like they're going to want to know where babies come from, and they're going to want to know why adoption came out, and they're going to be able to Google it too. They're quickly going to be able to like, well, adoption from China or adoption in Utah, like those laws. So they are going to be exposed to these questions and these answers, whether or not you're ready to tell them eventually. So it's better that it comes from you and that you're starting from a place of love and humility and understanding.
Yeah. Thank you. Such good advice. Okay, Melissa, thank you so much for joining us today. Your website is?
adopteethoughts.com, and you can find my social media at adoptee_thoughts, or just Google my name, Melissa Guida-Richards, and everything will pop up.
Perfect. Well, like I say, we will include all the links and those resources you mentioned in the show notes of today's episode. Go out and buy Melissa's book. Make sure you check out the Instagram account and all her other channels. And thank you so much for sharing everything with us. That was so helpful.
Thank you for having me. I'm sorry for rambling.
No, it wasn't a ramble at all. You're a wealth of information. It was amazing.
Thank you for joining us today for another episode of the Kids or Child Free podcast. Now, before you leave, I want to ask you to subscribe to the YouTube channel, because lo and behold, we have a YouTube channel. I've failed to tell most of you that this even exists. Now, you can not only find all episodes of the podcast on our YouTube channel, but you can also find short form videos. We've got them categorized based on the types of conversations I'm having, whether they're with parents, whether they're about being child free. We've got different tips on how you can navigate this kids or child free decision. So lots of good stuff there. Go check it out. Our YouTube channel is Kids or Child Free. I will have it linked in the show notes of today's episode, so you've got that handy. Otherwise, you can give it a search. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes or videos that we share on there. All right, that is all from me. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day.